Thank you all for returning for Sci-Fi Day 3. I'll be handing over to Terri, who will be chairing our panel on encoded patriarchy and patriarchy in workspaces. Over to you, Terri.
Thank you, Trisha, and thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to Sci-Fi 2020. This session is entitled Zero-Day Societies Encoded Patriarchy. My name is Terri Chapman. I'm a visiting fellow at ORF, and I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel of speakers. These include Laura Sallstrom, who's an associate professor at Duke University, Renata Avila, who will be joining us in a couple of minutes. She's the co-founder of the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, Soline Kauffman, who's the Engagement and Partnership Director at Blisce, and Aditi Kumar, who is the Executive Director at the Belfer Center. So today, we'll be discussing the intersection between technology, gender, and work. It's clear that in many domains, technology is reinforcing gender stereotypes, reproducing patriarchal social norms and systems, and further entrenching gender inequality. So in this brief conversation, we'll focus not on the what, but the how. So how can we address the complex and intersectional challenges of gender inequality in the digital age? So I'll begin by asking the panelists a few questions and giving them around 3 minutes to respond. And then we'll open it up for a brief Q&A session with the audience. So if you have questions, please send us a message. If you could please be very precise with your questions and direct them at one of the panelists, that would be great. So first, I would like to turn to Laura. Laura, I have a two-part question for you to begin with. So it is estimated that between 10 and 20% of AI researchers are female. So what does the data tell us about why there are so few women in the field? And second, what are some of the policy interventions that may assist with the lack of women in AI and STEM more broadly? Over to you.
Okay, thanks for the question, Terri. And I hope you guys will forgive me because I did write a few notes here, so I got the statistics correct. So I will look at my paper a bit to answer some of this. The headliner is that women's skills in AI are growing, so they're keeping a pace proportionally with men in terms of the percentage of women to men, but they're not gaining in AI. So those very low numbers, unfortunately, are staying consistent year to year. And I think looking at the data, you can look at it in sections. And one part of it is still discouraging because men are behind, but another part of it is more alarming to me. So when you're looking kind of at the basic data and the STEM sections of it, what you're seeing is that, again, the AI numbers are unfortunately staying the way that they are. And even in those countries where you have the greatest number of AI professionals, you're seeing some of the worst percentages of female to male ratios. So WEF LinkedIn did a study. US, India, and Germany have the highest number of AI professionals with 23%, 22%, and 12% respectively of women to men in AI professions. That Germany surprised me, by the way. We know that those numbers in some way mirror STEM development by young women. We know that girls are still dropping out of STEM earlier. We know also from the LinkedIn portion of this, which is interesting, is that women are not acquiring new or complex AI skills at the same rate as men are. They're getting AI skills, but they're getting them in different parts of AI skills. And we know that as AI tasks become more complex, there are less women involved in them. But what's more concerning to me is that there are parts of the data that suggest we're making progress in basic skills areas that should be promoting greater AI development, but it's not resulting in more women in AI. So for example, India, which is an outlier because of their success in getting women to go to university and take computer science classes, currently has 45% of women enrolled in computer science classes, but on the way to the workplace, a percentage of those women fall out. So there's only 25 to 30% of women actually doing those jobs. So there's an attrition that's happening somewhere between university and work. Similarly, in the US, you see women tend to leave digital employment at a rate twice that of men. And globally, women are more likely to complain about discrimination, about gender bias in the workplace as a reason for leaving. And then also discouraging, even in industries that are mostly dominated by women, or where you see large proportions of women, still in the AI support for those industries, they're mostly dominated by men. And in industries where they're already dominated by men, like in manufacturing and software services related industries where men already dominate, there's an accelerated rate of a higher level of AI workers. So, for example, Google shared some data that 21% of their technical roles are filled by women, but only 10% of their AI roles are filled by men. So from a policy perspective, I think that presents a really interesting challenge for us. It suggests that to a certain extent, the early intervention perhaps is not being registered yet. It takes a long time for those interventions to show up in actual workforce. But from a personal perspective, I think policy is on the right path for that. We're beginning to see some movement on a couple of those kinds of areas. What's more concerning to me is what's happening in the careers once women have succeeded in overcoming all of these hurdles, to then in their career path not be able to find a way forward into the AI field is perhaps something that requires more intervention. And I think it's more intervention in terms of mentorship, not just female mentorship, but also male mentorship and intervention into these to promote women into the workplace, to make sure you're creating environments for them to want to pivot to AI, perhaps to become even more creative in the policy making. So maybe you do something like create tax incentives when you have more diverse AI workforces, but focus on that, that career element, mentoring, retaining women, making sure they get into the workforce and find an environment in which they can succeed, I think is important.
Great, thank you so much. Renata, thank you for joining us. If you could turn on your video, that would be awesome. So I gave a brief introduction of you, and I have a quick question for you. So the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms calls on public and private sectors to advocate and adopt guidelines that establish accountability and transparency in automated decision making. Can you tell us a bit about how this can and should be achieved?
Sorry, first unmuting. Hi, everybody. It is great to be joining you. I don't know if my connection is very good, but yeah, it's great to be here. So with the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, what we are trying to do, concretely, a quick example. For example, it is highly likely we want to operate at a multilateral level, and I think that somehow women groups and women rights are confined to some little space, little corner in the room of the multilateral system. And we want to take over, we want to be present in each and every institution, deciding the standards, deciding the rules, deciding the policies on everything. For example, quick example, the World Trade Organization. It's highly likely that the next year a multilateral agreement or a plurilateral agreement on e-commerce is going to take place. And if we want to make, if we want the future of AI to be transparent and accountable, and if I'm for example, a judge in a jurisdiction, and I cannot audit the algorithms that are discriminating women because the trade rules that my country signed totally restrict on the trade secret laws and my ability to audit a black box, then it is a feminist issue. Then it is a gender equality issue. Then it's a general equality and democracy issue. But we often see all the commercial stuff as one box and all the feminist stuff as a different box, and it's all interlinked. Second example, WIPO. If we want the good data sets and the high quality data sets for feminist AI, we need to be watching that artificial restrictions right there at WIPO are not imposed on the future of AI, what will be the copyright of it? What will be like the rules guiding it? We need an aggressive, open and collaborative approach, public and private, to create the high quality data sets feminists need. Third example, World Health Organization. Imagine all the money that is going to technology to alleviate the COVID-19 crisis. Imagine how absent women are in the rooms designing those technologies. If I was the president of the world, I will impose, if I was heading the IMF or the World Bank or any of these institutions, and that's what the alliance is aiming to set that mentality. I will condition all the money allocated to fund technology to solve the COVID crisis to have women involved. And if they say, "Oh, there's not enough engineers," it doesn't need to be engineers. If something is a consensus now, is that we need more interdisciplinary presence in the rooms designing AI. So I want women leaders, I want nurses, I want a diverse representation of women present in the room designing AI, present in the emergency room deciding in the first place that AI is the technology that we should be using to address the crisis. And then I want an accountability team of women, of diverse women, evaluating if the tech interventions that we are pushing forwards are being beneficial or damaging their communities. So those three examples of what we are trying to achieve. We are part of the Generation Equality Coalition. We are co-leading the Tech and Innovation Coalition together with Women at the Table and a group of other organizations. And we hope that we get the ear of states and companies to move in that direction, to have this vision of inclusiveness and women's rights inside each and every institution, deciding norms and deciding how are we going to rebuild our societies after this crisis.
Great, thank you so much for that. And building on that, Soline, I'd like to turn to you next. So evidence suggests that when AI systems are used in hiring and recruitment, women tend to be excluded and are often discriminated against. So you've worked with many different tech startups, I assume, and what do you think is needed to bring more women into the tech industry and importantly into positions of power?
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Terri, and thanks to Sci-Fi for organizing this panel and this conference, despite the circumstances. I think there's always different ways, and being able to do this abroad and online is always great. Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of issues around, women not having access to technology, women not having access to just work opportunities in technology, and most of all, women not necessarily having access to work opportunities in investment. And I'm speaking from a position where I'm looking at different funds around me, and the gender gap is still quite staggering, unfortunately. I think there are approximately 10% of venture capital partners who are women, both in the States and in Europe. I haven't looked at the data in other markets, but it's more or less, I guess, the same. And I think that's the first condition that triggers and means that there are also less women being funded and less founders, being funded who are women. So I think there are different issues that go to hands, but if we want more women founders to get access to capital, there needs to be more women investors who provide them with the capital as well. And we know that one of the big issues with investment as an industry overall is that you tend to invest according to certain behaviors that are linked to your background. You tend to invest in people that you trust. And as a human being, you tend to trust people that look like you. And so if 90% of people holding capital are men, then it's very likely that they're going to invest in people who look like us, which are men. And so, beyond that, I think there are different things that need to be put in place to provide more access to funding to women, and provide them access, more importantly, to position of powers. On the short term, I think research is very important. If you're looking at research on women in the tech industry, I guess we're starting to track in the past 10 years. We've started, putting in place some systems to track gender diversity in different types of industries, and we can, retropetal and use data from prior times, but there's discrepancy with the data still at this stage, and I think it's very important to be able to track this data, get it, and be able to analyze it. I think the communication is very important as well. Having women promote themselves more, as well as allies promote women more. Education and coaching is also something that's quite important. Unconscious bias plays a very strong role in the way people behave towards women and the way they behave towards themselves. And so coaching, men in their own unconscious biases, as well as women in the way they adopt those unconscious bias, is very important. And then I think in the medium term, there are different things that need to be put in place. One is a legal framework. Some are against positive discrimination. I think I personally am for, not necessarily because it's important to have numbers, but more because if you don't put a certain level of expectation and you implement it from a legal perspective, it's never necessarily going to happen in a time frame that's acceptable. We're not speaking about 100 years, but 10 years. And just to give you an example, France passed a law in 2017 called the Copé-Zimmermann law, which required for supervisory boards at corporate organizations to have a gender diversity, so at least 40% of women on their board. And now we're, a few years down the line, and there's actually 43% of women who are board members. So it shows that law has a very strong impact. Now, the quality can be debated, but at least the numbers are there, and it's slowly but, moving in the right direction. I think there are various initiatives that exist as well, and it's going to be, a compound movement, but the fact that there are diversity certifications, that there are diversity and inclusion conversations, not only at governmental level, but also at each and every single company's level, is very important. Policies on parental leave is something that needs to be more spread, for sure. And then lastly, I'll mention one thing which is seldom mentioned in conversations around diversity and inclusion, but I think what we forget here is that we're dealing with behavioral change. If you're looking at the data around, the reasons why there needs to be more diversity, it's not just a question of ethics and a question of human rights. There's very strong economical interest in having, more diversity, whether gender or any other type of diversity. And yet, despite those, despite the numbers, you see that the change is very slow to happen. And so for me, the question of behavioral change is one that needs to be pushed forward. And also, how do you communicate behavioral change to each and every individual?
Okay, I'm not sure how much of that you got, but mostly I was just thanking you and the sci-fi team for putting together a great conference. So thank you for the question. I think the pandemic is highlighting the problems that already exist in our society, which is that women are, as you said, primary caregivers, and caregivers pay a career penalty. We know from the data that in terms of salaries and promotions, mothers are much further away from parity with men than women without children. We know that women take on more caring responsibilities at home, and that workplaces penalize them for working fewer hours or working flexibly or doing whatever they need to do to balance their home responsibilities and their work responsibilities. We know that early childhood education is the single most effective way to limiting gender inequality and encouraging women's participation in the workplace. The pandemic has just highlighted that. It has taken that away. It has taken away the ability of parents to drop their kids off at school and at daycares. And I think women stand to lose a decade or more of progress towards gender equality because of the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's partly because of schools and daycares. It's partly because women tend to have a higher share of jobs and services and other sectors that are disproportionately impacted. At least here in the United States, women make up just over 40% of the workforce, I think 43%, but have made up 56% of the job losses in the pandemic. So, I don't think there are any silver bullets here. We need to either learn to safely coexist with the virus or vaccinate a lot of people and reopen our schools and our daycare facilities. We knew in March that this virus was going to be a problem, right? We knew in March that it was going to be something that was going to spread rapidly in our communities and that it was not something that we could solve with a vaccine in the very, very near term. And I think at that point, the federal, state, local governments, they had the time to figure out how to safely reopen schools. We should have been laser focused on the schools, because when we take care of our children, then the productivity gains flow to women and all parents. So I think that was a huge missed opportunity. And I think now what we need to do is pivot to those priority areas. As long as we don't have herd immunity from a vaccine, we need to control the spread of the virus. We need lots of PPE. We need rapid tests. And we need to focus on safely reopening schools. And I think until we do that, we're going to continue to see slides in gender parity in the workforce, because there just isn't an option. I oversee an organization of over 200 people, and I can tell you that it's just, and I know you know this already, and everybody watching knows this already, it's incredibly hard for us to be productive in an environment like this. It's incredibly hard for us to provide the education, the mentorship opportunities, the research that our institution is committed to, and it's because we can't rely on the productivity of parents when they have so many responsibilities at home. So for me, it all comes down to schools. We need to focus on reopening the schools. We need to do it safely. And I think this is just a longer term priority of providing affordable childcare, as Soline mentioned, providing family leave and maternity leave policies that make sense. But I think in the pandemic, it's just highlighted for us the urgency of these issues.
Great, thank you so much for that, Aditi. And Laura, I want to circle back to you. So many people have argued that standards related to gender and AI need to be holistic, and they need to move beyond addressing gender gaps in data and thinking about it as a data issue. Can you talk to us a little bit about what a holistic gendered approach to AI standards should look like?
Yes. So let me also, because I know we want part of this to be conversational, just echo and compliment Soline for the outline of policies that she talked about there, particularly those around career and work-life balance, because I do think that, again, those are the types of things that are keeping women from progressing their career into AI. And I think it is important for us to bring all of these points back to AI because, again, from your thought with a holistic perspective, we know that this technology has an impact just beyond the fact that there are less women involved in it. It reinforces gender biases in many, many areas, not just because of the data set, but because of who's creating the algorithms and who are the skilled workers inputting into it. So when I think about AI and technology policy generally, I do a little backup to what are the categories of things that are essential for a business or a country to succeed in AI. And from my perspective, there are it's very narrow, but there are three categories really. One of them is that you have to have lots and lots of data. The other is that you have to have great algorithms. And the third is that you need to have an AI skilled workforce. So I don't think we can entirely throw out the data conversation because we know that a lot of the gender bias is there. So that is not settled yet. It still has a lot of hurdles to go through in order to try to create a framework where it can be balanced. Just even raising awareness among the group that's looking at the data now, we know isn't sufficient because that group of people carries with them their own biases. So you really need these kinds of panels that Renata was talking about, a diverse group looking at the data sets. I think there's also some interesting things being done now with technology to try to prevent technology from being biased with the data, like the Microsoft Research Project with Boston University that looks at word association in AI and then corrects the word association. So I think the famous example was something like computer science is to men as home worker is to, or housekeeper is to woman. So they look at how the technology is associating words and correct it, but you still then have to ask yourself who's inputting into that process. So is the Boston University team a group of American men? Is it a diverse global group looking at it? How many women are involved in it? You're still placing the burden of that screening on experts, right? So you do have to make sure that who's looking, the group looking at it is sufficiently diverse. So data is its own issue. Algorithms. We have an algorithm expert here, so I hesitate to comment on that. Renata, I was really very interested in your comments. One that does hesitate for me a little bit is the totally open algorithm. So industry, if industry sees their algorithms as a competitive advantage, they're always going to want to have some control over them or intellectual property over them. So how do you create a framework where they can be open, but you can also provide, let companies have the commercial advantage they need? And I think there are ways to be creative about that. So maybe there's an international group that becomes the international expert on that, but agrees to reserve the intellectual property on it. But you again then have this issue of a small pool of women who are expert and able to look at it. As you said, there are different skill sets to be able to evaluate these things. But from a technical perspective, for example, I don't have the skill set to look at an algorithm. That is a unique class or a unique policy issue, I think, within these three categories of things that really go into AI. And by the way, there's been some proposals that government regulate these things, which I think is, sorry, a little bit of a total disaster to have them as technology experts looking at them, considering how difficult it is already for government to attract high-skilled and high-qualified talent. So ensuring expertise and diverse expertise, I think, is the policy nugget there that has to be cracked. And then I won't comment on skills because I think most of this conversation is about skills. And I'll turn it over because I'm very curious to hear the feedback and talk about this.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. Renata, I want to give you a chance to respond to Laura's comments, and I also want to pose a question. So I'm going to pose the question first, and then you can respond as you see fit. So the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms has partnered with the International Development Research Center to launch the Feminist AI Research Network. I was hoping you can tell us a little bit about this and how the network is working to leverage AI for women's rights. So if you want to sort of elaborate on that a little bit and potentially respond to Laura's comments, that'd be great.
Yeah, very quickly on the network. We are very excited about this launch of the network. We are almost 65, not all are online, but 65 mostly Global South experts, men and women, working towards this issue. And what we wanted was to have a common place for the conversations to take place, but also sometimes there's no a consensus on the terminology that we use and on general basic concepts. And we wanted to, so this phase, in the last 4 to 5 months, what we have been doing is having conversations, cross-regional, interdisciplinary conversations about methodologies, about data, about the very basics of AI, and seeing and how is it impacting our regions. And when we had the first group, the last input of the first group was a common research agenda. So each of the researchers shared the 2 most pressing issues that they wanted to explore. And that was it is a wonderful South-South cross-pollinating interdisciplinary exercise on basically seeing all the things that we don't know and choosing the strategic topics that we want to pick for a common work in the next 3 years, hopefully, and also benefit and identify both threats and opportunities emerging in different regions outside the EU and outside US. But we also include EU and US researchers because the companies are mostly coming from there. So that's what we are doing, and we are starting with the next group, and the next group is mostly composed by technologists. So it's going to be a very different conversation, but the whole group is also joining. So, for example, yesterday we had our inaugural talk, and we had Safia Noble talking to all of them. So it is getting very exciting. It's kind of by invitation only, but the results will be published and shared broadly. To answer the questions, I think that the state has a fundamental role. The state is a very, very important, because we as citizens, we can advocate and we can campaign and everything, but at the end it's our money that is being spent in these systems multiplying inequalities. So at least, not for everything, not for all industries, not for each and every sector, but at least if a state is buying AI systems and is using these AI systems, for example, for social protection and so on, I want to be like that system subject to the highest levels of scrutiny. And we know that one of the first restrictions that trade rules impose is on procurement, on public procurement. So at least the public procurement rules should be preserved so to be at maximum full. If I am allocating social benefits with it, sorry, your trade secret stops there. I need, if I'm a public institution deploying this system, I have responsibilities and accountability that I cannot. We need to rethink in this era all the trade secret rules, especially because these companies usually are free riding on a lot of subsidies and benefits. The other thing is proactive disclosure, and we have done it with many industries. That even with the food industry, when we eat something, except if it's an apple, that is obvious what's inside an apple. The more processed the food is, the more disclosure we have in the package, and that was a big fight for consumer rights. Maybe we need not only standards, but maybe we need. I think that labeling might be a good forwards. The third thing is is a very limited set of actors doing like the AI that worries us, and the power is so concentrated that only the state. The state might not know, but I think that it is. The ignorance or incompetence of a state shouldn't be an excuse to release them from the responsibilities and rely on self-regulation. Self-regulation is leading to nowhere in most of the fields, as we have seen with many of the environmental disasters. Only when the state, and many times was too late, stepped in, was able to stop further damage. And so I think that it is up to us to help the state get up to speed and educate and work together with the state. It is the crisis of our times we have to stop this narrative and really try to fix this reality of the state knowledge gap. If we have the knowledge and they don't have the knowledge, let's share that knowledge and reach a speedy understanding of the issues. But do not, do not release them from the responsibility, because at the end, it is our money that pays them, and it is our vote that elects them. So it is up to us somehow to fix it. The state is us, is not some entity disconnected from the realities that we live in. Yeah, only that.
Great, thank you so much. Aditi, I want to turn to you now, and please feel free to respond to Laura and Renata's comments and insights, but I'm going to pose a question to you as well. So the application of AI risks and is reproducing in many cases unjust social structures. Many of the world's largest tech companies have incorporated the idea of AI for social good. How are and can companies' competing goals and values, such as gender equality, be agreed upon and addressed?
Sure, and I'm hoping I won't freeze this time, but you'll let me know if I do. So thank you to Laura and Renata on your comments on this too. I couldn't agree more. And using your framework, Laura, of the data, the algos, and the skilled workforce, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the data. I think the tech companies and their algorithms, they're just reflecting the values in society. If there's bias in AI, it's because there's bias in society, and the AI is learning that. So at the Belfer Center, one of the things we study is how we endow technology with the values that we want society to embody. And I think that starts with data and builds then from the actual design of the algorithm and the people who are monitoring it. But you all will know there was a famous case of Amazon's hiring algorithm, which was supposed to be this great thing, but it learned pretty quickly to just throw out women's resumes and only choose men for hiring and for promotions. And the team actually went back in and they debiased the data. They moved over references to gender from the applications. But the AI just worked around it to search for things like participation in women's clubs or women's organizations to get the same results. The problem wasn't that the AI was biased. It was doing perfectly fine in solving the question that was asked to solve, which is, what is the profile of candidates that have been historically successful and have achieved promotions at Amazon? And therefore, those are our indicators of success. So I think the problem Amazon needed to solve was, how do we fix the bias in the hiring and promotion process, which has historically excluded women? And that, I think, needs human decision making. It needs human policies. It needs policies like the ones that we've been discussing already, like maternity leave that doesn't count against you, like flex work options, like benefits that cover childcare, in addition to correcting all the basic sexist stuff that happens in most companies. So, I do believe that we need to look closely at our AI, and we need to make sure that the training data that it uses is debiased, is gender disaggregated. I saw that somebody mentioned that in the comments, gender disaggregated data. I think it's really important. But also, I think the data needs to reflect the patterns that we want the AI to learn. It can be accurate and not do that. And I think that's a problem. So, looking ahead, we need more women to be part of drug trials, like the COVID-19 vaccine trials. I think it's important that we understand if the vaccine and the virus behaves differently by sex. We need more people of color to be included in facial recognition technology and voice recognition technology. But we also need to make sure that we're not feeding our AI data that is accurate but discriminatory against women and other minority groups. And I think we do that in a lot of the ways that Renata outlined. I think a lot of it for tech companies, frankly, is commercial pressure. I think there's a business case, right, to having your products and your AI work for all people. I don't think that's enough. I think, organizations like the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, the Algorithmic Justice League, I think the nonprofit sector and these watchdog organizations, the Belfer Center, academics, I think we have a huge role to play in researching these things and shedding light on these things. And I do think that there is a role for policymakers. And I think this is a tricky place because of the complexity and the diversity of the issues that we're talking about. There is no catch-all policy to fix discrimination in AI. There isn't. So I agree with Renata, when we are selling these products or developing these products for public use, like law enforcement using facial recognition technology, I completely agree. We need the highest standard. We need the best minds looking at this and making sure that we're not feeding in data that promotes criminal injustice into AIs that we're using for law enforcement purposes. I think that needs to happen. But I also think we just need common sense tech regulation policies that we have talked about and at this conference for years, right? We need to make tech companies be more transparent about the data they're collecting, how they're using that data. We need them to do audits on their algorithms, and we need to report that out. And I don't think it is a holistic policy that will catch all the problems that we're talking about here, but I think the combination of watchdogs that are shedding light on this problem, commercial pressure that is just showing that more inclusive products that work for everybody work better, and the policy angle, we need to work together across these three prongs to promote more equality in this space.
Can I jump in and maybe comment very quickly on the commercial pressure a point that you made, Aditi, because I think it's a very pertinent one, and one that a lot of people are unconscious of to a certain extent. I was reading an article the other day which was focusing on the US tech industry, and essentially it was saying that diversity, an increase of diversity by 5% could result in 1.2 percent of the national GDP increase, which represents $500 billion. And so if you put it that way, the figures are completely staggering. And you can bring it back to the level of a company. Like in the startup industry, I was also looking at some data from an IBM study on this, and it was saying that a company which has 10 million in revenue, so in many ways a small company, still tech startup, if it managed to increase its diversity pool, and I'm not specifically speaking about gender, but just any type of diversity, by 15%, it could gain up to 2 million per year in revenue. And if you're thinking about it that way, I think any company would want to have 2 more million annually. So it's very interesting, I think, to mention that. But I also had a question, because I was listening to your comments, Aditi and Laura, what you're mentioning, and also Renata, and I wonder to what extent, because we're talking about how AI, or the biases that are being put in AI, and how data is being pulled in and used, and the repercussions that it has on society overall. But I wonder to what extent there's a way where AI could be shaped and reverse engineered so that it corrects human unconscious biases. Is it something that anyone has delved into, or an idea that people have explored?
Does anyone want to respond to that?
One of the arguments for deploying AI is conversely that it can eliminate bias, for example, in hiring. So that's been one of the arguments for using it, and it's not turned out that way. But I think the objective is that if you train it in a particular way, then you create something that is less biased than a human being. But then that goes back to the ethical question of who's providing the inputs. And so going back to this point of who's going to regulate it, I will tell you that right now, I would not want my government to be the social and behavioral standard setter for AI, for criminal justice, for any of these very sensitive areas right now. So this question of who controls and how do you create something that is truly neutral in order to get the desired output you want, I think is a very complicated thing. But yes, I think the selling point of AI is ultimately that we want it to be neutral. We want it to be data driven. I'm just not sure that there's very much that's gotten there yet.
So we have just 2 minutes left, but I want to give Aditi and Renata a very quick opportunity to respond to Soline's question. So do either of you have comments?
Renata, do you want to go ahead?
Quickly, I think that it's very hard to fix what is already programmed to, in a broken way and designed in a flawed way, defective by design, as the free software community says. I think that we need to build something new, and we need the commitment of governments to fund that part. And as we did with public education, maybe public AI, public feminist AI can be the way. So let us play with the systems. Let us transform our public infrastructures, at least social AI.
Yeah, maybe I'm just a little bit cynical on this, Soline. I just don't think AI is the answer to correcting inequality in our society. In the hiring example I gave, you can have the best hiring AI ever and avoid all the pitfalls that Amazon fell into. But until you have sensible policies to support your workforce and make them successful, you're going to keep coming up with patterns that select for the majority. Like that's just going to keep happening. And the AI will just learn from that. And so I just come back to the fact that we need to actually fix the underlying problems, and that, you know, AI won't be the solution to that. It's actually common sense human decision making that will fix it, and the AI is an extension of that and can learn from it.
Soline, 30 seconds. Do you have any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to share?
Well, I recently watched The Social Dilemma. I'm sure, you know, a few of you have seen this documentary, and I came out of it, and I, you know, in many ways, I think everyone in this panel is fairly educated to the challenges that technology poses in our everyday life. I recognize myself quite a lot in terms of the some of the crazy behaviors I have when I scroll social media, or when I'm completely addicted to my emails. And so, yeah, I was wondering if, you know, people who have been smart enough to get us addicted to notifications could use some of their, you know, intellectual power to some better use, with, you know, commercial means as well. And so I'll put that out there in the World Wide Web and for people who are watching us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists. This was a great conversation. There's so much more that we could unpack, but unfortunately it's a very short session. So I want to thank all of you, and of course thank Aura. And Trisha, I'd like to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Terri. And as always, a fascinating conversation. And I feel like most of these conversations end with the fact that we need to throw the entire system away and rebuild it from ground up. But yes, thank you all for joining us. We'll be back in 15 minutes with a speed talk by Dr. Elma Gurmeet, and then our final panel of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.